week on Vice, the rise of a dictator in Venezuela.
That's the member of parliament.
Imagine a U.S. Marine, governor of New York.
There is no fear anymore. This is a citizens' revolution. You can feel it on the streets.
Today, the instructions are for all the protesters to stay in separate groups across the city to make it harder for the National Guard to break them up.
Estoy dispuesto a todo, junto al pueblo en la calle.
In recent weeks, the crisis in Venezuela has frequently been in the news. This resource-rich nation, with the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, is on the verge of total collapse. Hyperinflation, widespread food shortages, and one of the highest murder rates in the world has fueled almost continuous daily protests across the country. Much of the anger is directed at President Nicolas Maduro and his ruling Socialist Party.
El nivel de odio e intolerancia que se ha sembrado ha generado una violencia fascista.
Critics say Maduro's authoritarian regime is guilty of large-scale corruption and involvement in narco-trafficking. Earlier this year, President Maduro announced his intention to rewrite the nation's constitution in what is widely seen as an attempt to consolidate power. With tensions escalating, Vice sent both Soroush Alvi and Ben Anderson to Caracas to cover the crisis.
Protesting 4 out of the 7 days of the week. There is no fear anymore. This is a citizens' revolution. You can feel it on the streets. People aren't afraid. They're ready to fight.
Peleamos por nuestro país porque ya es hora de que este país cambie. Por eso es que todo el mundo está pasando hambre. Igualito nosotros no nos vamos a mover de aquí porque este país es de nosotros.
We're in the thick of it now. These kids are making Molotov cocktails, they're smashing boulders, making smaller rocks to throw, tear gas everywhere.
Since the anti-government uprisings exploded this past spring, Venezuelans have been demonstrating in the streets for over 100 days. More than 100 have been killed and thousands more injured.
They're shooting marbles at the kids now.
And the more the protesters defy the authorities, the more aggressive the police get in trying to break them.
There's only one way in and one way out, so it makes for a stampede-like situation.
What's happening? I don't know what's happening.
Chaos all day. We're just trying to leave it now. We're boxed in. They've cut off all the roads. I got trampled and lost my shoes, so I'm now strolling around Venezuela in my socks.
Venezuela is on the brink of becoming a failed state. The economy has been destroyed by hyperinflation. In the last 12 months alone, the inflation rate rose over 1,000%, and it's projected by the IMF to rise more than 2,000% in 2018. As Venezuela's currency has cratered in value, the cost of importing the most basic goods has soared, making food and other essentials both scarce and unaffordable.
Ordinary people are really suffering. and they're fighting back.
Veteran journalist Phil Gunson, who's been covering the region for almost 40 years, has witnessed firsthand the events that have brought Venezuela to the brink. What caused the current situation with chaos reigning in the streets?
Now that the economy has collapsed, the issue on the streets is not an issue of ideology. It's not people out on the streets saying, we want capitalism instead of socialism. It's people out on the streets saying, we want to eat.
Tenemos hambre, hay hambre. Hago una cola todo el santo día, no consigo nada. Tengo meses que no compro leche. La carne, el pollo, carísimo si logras conseguirlo.
Esto es recorte de pescado que está comiendo la gente, miren, cabezas de pescado, miren. Recorte que antes comían eran los perros, con el perdón de los perros.
This food shortage is widespread. Over the last year, 3/4 of the population has lost an average of almost 20 pounds.
Mira como yo era de gordo, ¿eh? Mire cuántos huecos le echaba la correa, la dieta de Maduro.
People are genuinely dying of hunger in some cases. 12% of children are suffering from acute malnutrition in Venezuela. This is the country with the biggest oil reserves in the world. It's absolutely unforgivable.
Oil is the foundation of the Venezuelan economy, accounting for half of the government's revenue. So the nation's economy and fortunes rise and fall with the price of crude oil on international markets.
Venezuela is well over 90% dependent on oil income for its foreign earnings. The society has come to rely on this economic cycle of boom and bust that's inherent in oil. And it's created a society in which there's very little planning for the future. Corruption is kind of, at least to a large extent, tolerated.
By the late 1970s, oil had made Venezuela the richest country in South America. But over the coming decades, persistent corruption funneled the nation's wealth into the hands of the elite. The result was profound income inequality that set the stage for a socialist revolution led by Hugo Chavez.
Haré cumplir, impulsaré las transformaciones democráticas necesarias.
Chavez was a larger-than-life figure, messianic, a figure who was loved not just as a politician, but revered as a saint by millions of people in Venezuela.
Chavez made government a spectacle.
Tarde, mi casa bien equipada. Elia, un aplauso pues para mi casa bien equipada.
Every Sunday, he staged marathon TV broadcasts that sometimes ran up to 8 hours on his show, Aldo Presidente. On top of announcing government business, such as nationalizing agriculture and telecom industries, the show featured special guests, dance numbers, and prize giveaways.
Televisores, mira cómo llaman esto, de pantalla plana. Eso es un proceso contrario al capitalismo.
But while he was giving away appliances, the economy, and specifically the oil industry, was crumbling.
The problem is that the economic underpinnings of what he was about were not really viable.
The legacy of Chavez's disastrous economic strategy is the heart of today's crisis. We flew to Lake Maracaibo, epicenter of the country's boom and bust economy.
This is one of the largest oil basins in the world. Over 30 billion barrels of oil have been pulled out of this lake, and the estimates range that there are still somewhere between 19 and another 40 billion barrels of oil still left down there.
Ulysses Albornoz worked for the state-run oil company, Petroleum of Venezuela, or PDVSA, and experienced the effect of Chavez's policies firsthand.
When Chavez entered the government, he politicized PDVSA.
One of Chavez's first moves to change the oil industry was replacing the PDVSA board of directors with political allies. Much of the PDVSA workforce was outraged and took to the streets. In response, Chavez fired 7 of the company's top executives live on TV.
Despido de las siguientes personas. Señor Juan Fernández está despedido de Petróleos de Venezuela. Eddie Ramírez
muchas gracias. Está usted despedido.
In the end, Chavez fired 18,000 PDVSA employees and replaced them with more politically loyal workers who knew next to nothing about oil production.
So basically, Chavez fired almost half of the 40,000 employees of the state oil companies.
He fired 18,000 people.
18,000 people, and you were one of them.
Yeah, I was one of them. Now has 120,000 people and is down. With 3 times the quantity of people,
yeah,
you produce 1/3 of the oil.
Got it.
In addition to the incompetence of the Chavez loyalists who run PDVSA, corruption has been a major factor in the decline of the oil industry. Billions have been stolen in recent years, creating a new and very rich socialist elite. With oil production at all-time lows, Venezuela's economy is now much more vulnerable to the ups and downs of the global market.
Venezuela is acutely vulnerable to a fall in the price of oil, which, as we know, tends to be cyclical. And it tends to be severe when it happens. And essentially what Venezuela is living on now is less than half of the oil price that it had a few years back. The oil money ran out more or less at the same time as Chavez died. So simultaneously, they lost a large amount of income, plus the guy that held the whole thing together. And it's been downhill ever since.
A month after Chavez's death in 2013, a bitterly divided nation went to the polls. Vice President Nicolas Maduro, a former bus driver, narrowly won the presidential election over opposition leader Enrique Capriles. Since then, Maduro has stuck with many of Chavez's policies and for the most part has ruled by decree. Meanwhile, the economy, hunger, narco-trafficking and violent crime have continued to spiral out of control, and the opposition to his government intensified. By December of 2015, Venezuelans had voted to give control of Venezuela's Congress, the National Assembly, to the opposition parties. In response, Maduro called a special election to create a constituent assembly, a unique institution with the power to change the nation's constitution. Many believe he will use this governmental body to consolidate his power.
Convoco al poder constituyente originario. Convoque una asamblea nacional constituyente.
It is this move that has sparked the intensified protests of the past 3 months.
No queremos, no que ahora no que hará consultivo para aquí no queremos constituyente, aquí no queremos que ese tipo se dé cuenta de que el pueblo no lo quiere.
Maduro's forces have responded with mass arrests and violence that also frequently target elected officials from the opposition, including Capriles, his presidential opponent in 2013, who with 49% of the vote lost by less than 2 percentage points.
We're outside the Justice First office. The head of the party, Enrique Capriles, just got beat down by the National Guard here, and there's still tear gas and clashing going on. They're about to do a press conference.
Tengo un cangazo que me dieron en el rostro, otro golpe que me dieron en el rostro. Lo que le faltó fue cuando yo le dije, pero me va, y le digo, pero yo soy el gobernador de este estado. A mí me importa un carajo quién eres tú.
Hello, Governor. How are you?
Hola.
Nice to meet you. Mucho gusto.
Imagine a U.S. Marine, governor of New York.
Yeah, it's shocking.
It's shocking. It's incredible. It's Maduro's orders. Fight, the gas.
After this violence, what's going to happen tomorrow?
Mañana volvemos otra vez. Es una resistencia. Un gobierno que se va aislando y un país que sigue en la calle exigiendo respeto a la Constitución. Pero nos vienen más días de lucha. Estamos conscientes de eso.
In the 2 months after we filmed, and as the date of Maduro's Constituent Assembly approached, the crisis has escalated. On June 27th, a police officer hijacked a helicopter and attacked the Maduro-controlled Supreme Court with grenades and gunfire. Only days later, Maduro loyalists stormed the National Assembly, attacking security guards, journalists, and the lawmakers themselves. On July 16th, in a show of mass defiance, more than 7 million Venezuelans voted to recall Maduro in a symbolic nationwide referendum.
Pasar por encima de la Constitución, eso no lo podemos permitir los venezolanos.
On the eve of this historic vote that looked set to transform Venezuela, Vice went back to Caracas with Ben Anderson.
This is the National Assembly, Venezuela's Congress. 4 weeks after Maduro loyalists attacked the politicians. Congressman Armando Armas was one of the lawmakers badly beaten that day.
Armando Armas fue agredido por los grupos violentos colectivos.
That's definitely my blood. It was my head and this my hand.
And the risk of physical danger continues. First Vice President of the National Assembly, Freddy Guevara, showed us the death threats he's been receiving on a daily basis.
Save your money for you pay the funeral of every member of your family.
This is not normal business for a politician. And there will be a big protest this afternoon.
I'm sure that the protest will increase. We are not going to step down.
Today, the instructions are for all the protesters to stay in separate groups across the city to make it harder for the National Guard to break them up. Protests had been outlawed with tough sentences for those who disobeyed. We've just left the second area where there's a small protest. There's hundreds of National Guard on motorbikes. The National Guard maintained rigid control of the Caracas streets. We caught up with Freddy Guevara again, who said that the upcoming vote was just rubber stamping Maduro's drive towards authoritarian rule. Do you think it's a dictatorship now, or do you think it will become one on Sunday?
We have 109 people shot and dead in the protest. We have congressmen in jail, mayors in jail, no freedom of speech. Of course, we're a dictatorship. What we may have after Sunday will be a more intense phase of the dictatorship. But we are a dictatorship now.
You think you might all be in jail on Monday?
Yes, of course. They have, well, the president today, yesterday, and 3 days ago threatened me. He says that I have a jail with my name on it.
President Maduro called this election to create a constituent assembly, a 545-seat governmental body that can override and likely replace the elected Congress. It would also have the power to rewrite the country's constitution and extend Maduro's reign. If that weren't enough, the majority of candidates were hand-picked supporters of Maduro, including his wife and son, and there was no option to oppose the move. With no possible way to vote against the government's proposed action, the opposition boycotted the election, hoping a low turnout at many polling places would expose the vote as a sham. Instead, people again gathered on the streets in the only way they could to make their voices heard.
Yo digo que la elección del PSUV ni siquiera es la elección de tal como uno como el venezolano que sale a votar.
But just as demonstrations began to form, the National Guard followed through on threats to crush any dissent. By midday, opposition leaders were regrouping, trying to decide what to do next.
Claro, la libertad, Venezuela, eso es que apoyo yo. A Venezuela entera, la libertad, la democracia por el país. No solamente Freddy Guevara, a Venezuela, a todos los de la Asamblea Nacional, ¡viva Venezuela!
Miren, desde 1898, en Venezuela no había una elección que había tenido simultáneamente la gente en la calle protestando y siendo reprimida. Creo que es muy importante que todos tengan claro el día de hoy el rotundo fracaso que ha sido para el régimen este fraude constitucional.
One motorcycle unit of the National Guard was attacked with a homemade petrol bomb. Seven guards were injured.
Esta es un farsante. Esta constituyente lo que quiere es
que ellos estén más tiempo en el poder, porque no pueden dejar el poder, porque son corruptos, son ladrones, y en ningún lado los van a recibir.
Intense clashes across the country made this day the most violent since the crisis began. By the time the results were announced, 16 people had been killed and dozens more injured. But Maduro had succeeded in creating his constituent assembly.
Me preocupa muchísimo. Mañana no sé qué irá a pasar. No sé qué irá a pasar en los próximos días, pero tengo mucho miedo.
There have been a record number of deaths today, 16 confirmed deaths across Venezuela.
At the opposition headquarters, Governor Enrique Capriles, Maduro's presidential rival, made a statement to the local press.
La jornada de hoy, señores periodistas, pueblo venezolano, se resume en dos palabras: abstención y represión. Señores, nosotros estamos listos para la alternabilidad y vamos a luchar para que en este país haya alternabilidad, haya cambio, haya democracia y que los venezolanos podamos salir del hueco donde nos han metido y superar la peor crisis de toda nuestra historia.
I'm sure you know what the final result will be. What will be your response?
El gobierno dirá que votaron 10 millones. Pero llega un momento que la verdad es imposible de ocultar. La soledad de los centros lo vio el mundo.
Later that night, we headed over to Bolivar Plaza in the city center, where Maduro supporters had gathered.
Porque no estás solo, Chávez siempre está en tu corazón.
Nuestro compatriota Nicolás Maduro. Buenos días, Venezuela. Tenemos asamblea constituyente.
So it's
Que me inviten,
pretty incredible. This is the president
porque voy a
announcing the
comparecer
great victory.
para reconocer su
And the
poder
squares,
plenipotenciario. Está por encima del poder
2,000
constituyente.
people here, 300 or 400 are security.
Han dado el primer boletín, más de 8 millones. Es la votación más grande que haya sacado la revolución bolivariana en toda la historia electoral de 18 años. Se acabó el sabotaje, caballero, de la Asamblea Nacional. Se acabó lo que se daba. Ellos van a seguir en su locura, se van apagando cada vez más. Algunos terminarán en una celda bajo el mando de la justicia necesaria. Ha dicho hoy un vocero del gobierno del emperador Donald Trump que ellos no reconocen los resultados de las elecciones de la Asamblea Nacional Constituyente de Venezuela. ¿Qué carajo nos importa a nosotros lo que diga Trump? Nos importa lo que dice el pueblo soberano de Venezuela.
It was predictable that the United States would cast doubt on this vote. Much harder to refute was a claim from the London-based technology firm that supplied the voting machines used for this election.
The turnout numbers on Sunday, 30th of July, for the Constituent Assembly in Venezuela were tampered with. The difference between the actual participation and the one announced by the authorities is at least 1 million votes.
An independent exit poll suggested the actual turnout was even lower, with just over 3.5 million people voting, less than 20% of Venezuela's 19.8 million eligible voters. The Congress met in a last-ditch effort to stop what looked to be inevitable. They're calling on the people of Venezuela to come and defend this National Assembly. The United States imposed additional sanctions aimed directly at Maduro himself.
Maduro is not just a bad leader, he is now a dictator.
Maduro immediately played the part of a typical dictator. snatching two leading opposition figures, Leopoldo Lopez, a leader of the Popular Will Party, and Antonio Ledesma, the former mayor of Caracas, from their homes the following night. The socialist revolutionaries who once overthrew an unpopular and corrupt elite have become one. Even parts of the military began to defect.
Nos declaramos en legítima rebeldía, unidos hoy más que nunca con el bravo pueblo de Venezuela para desconocer la tiranía asesina de Nicolás Maduro.
One of Latin America's most important nations in control of the world's largest oil reserves has become a dictatorship.
Yo les juro que voy a dedicar toda mi vida para que esta revolución viva un renacer profundo de pueblo, de justicia, de igualdad, para que esta revolución levante cabeza.
But while Maduro's die-hard supporters celebrate, the growing opposition has vowed to continue to fight.